minutes by NRDC.
So great. Well, thanks everyone, and good day. Thank you for joining. My name is Jason Babby. I'm with Natural Resources Defense Council, or NRDC, and thank you for joining the webinar that NRDC and the Rockefeller Foundation are hosting to explore some potential strategies for cities to reduce the food going into landfills and putting it to better use, such as feeding more people. For those that, we are sort of joined together as these two institutions because with the generous support and thought partnership of the Rockefeller Foundation, NRDC has been working to better understand and reduce sort of food waste in American cities. For those that are not familiar, NRDC is an international organization that combines the power of our members with over 500 scientists, lawyers, and policy advocates around the globe to ensure the rights of all people to the air, water, and wild. And for those that aren't familiar, the Rockefeller Foundation is over 100 years old and has been working to promote the well-being of humanity throughout the globe. Today, Rockefeller Foundation has two goals: advancing inclusive economies and building resiliency. On the phone, we have over 20 cities that have registered and signed up for this. They range from Los Angeles to Philadelphia and Austin to Minneapolis. I'm going to just do a brief rundown of the folks that you will be hearing from today in the order in which you'll be hearing them. My name, again, is Jason Babby. I'm the Deputy Director for Urban Solutions at NRDC, which works to create strong, just, and resilient communities in America. You'll also be hearing from Monica Munn, who's a Senior Program Associate at the Rockefeller Foundation, leading the Foundation's domestic part of the Global Yield-Wise Initiative. You'll be hearing from Dana Gunders, who's a senior scientist at NRDC, and her focus is to promote sustainability throughout the food systems and supply chains. Darby Hoover, who's a senior resource specialist at NRDC and is helping to create strategies to improve the efficiency of the food system. Joanne, as for those that are joining, if you could put your audio on mute, please, that would be wonderful. Thank you very much. You'll also be hearing from Joanne Birkenkamp, who's a senior associate at NRDC, and she focuses on improving the efficiency of the U.S. food system by reducing food waste from farm to fork. And lastly, but not least, is Yelena Mujica, is the director of the Center for Market Innovations at NRDC, which leverages the power of the markets to drive sustainable solutions. Just a couple of logistics. We are having some technical difficulties, so we will not be able to use the chat bar as of now, or can we now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we've resolved one of our technical difficulties. If you have a specific, we will have specific times within this 2 hours to have questions and answers and discussions. But if you would like to use the chat bar for a very specific question that you have that you want to get out before you forget it, or if that's simply a format that you're more comfortable with, please do so. We will work to include those questions during the discussions sections, or we can also follow up with you specifically offline. I really want to underscore that we do want to hear from you. We want to know what you are thinking of, what you think about what we present, but we also want to know about what your experiences are, have been, and what you're interested in. Today is focusing on sort of a curated set of policies and programs available to reduce food waste in cities. But I want to flag that, that we will be presenting some preliminary data on food waste and rescue information, but that is really simply to provide some context for the policies. We will have a webinar in the fall that delves much deeper into the food waste and food rescue research. It's just that data are going through some final analyses before we can feel comfortable presenting the full range of data. Next slide. Great. So today, again, we're going to provide a little context, go over the toolkit. We're going to have different times for feedback and talk a little bit about what's next. And then just sort of as a general reminder, again, if you're not sort of speaking at the time, if you could please put your audio on mute, it helps for everyone's listening enjoyment. And with that, I will turn this over to Monica.
Thanks, Jason. And thank you for the earlier introduction. And welcome everyone to this webinar. We're so excited to have such a diverse and impressive array of cities and policymakers on the phone and some on video perhaps today. As Jason mentioned at the start, my name is Monica Munn, and I'm part of the Rockefeller Foundation's YieldWise initiative, which is the foundation's $130 million commitment to work across the global food supply chain and reduce food loss and waste. And this really builds on the foundation's legacy of working in food and agriculture for over 100 years, from production and spurring the Green Revolution to now working to make sure that all of the food that we grow goes to the best use, which is people eating it. And so here in the United States, our focus is really to reduce food waste that happens in homes and in businesses and in cities across the country. And we're so excited to be working with NRDC on this project to unearth new insights and best practices when it comes to reducing food waste in cities. And, through our work with cities across the country on many issues, as some may know, particularly on issues of resilience, we really see opportunities for food waste reduction to have multitudes of environmental, health, economic, and resilience impacts for cities. So I want to keep this short and sweet and really get into the meat of the presentation. The foundation has a large portfolio of work around urban food waste, which I'm happy to share more about at the end of the webinar and draw some connections to other projects and topics that you might find of interest as you look to stay involved in the food waste reduction efforts. So with that, I will turn it over to the NRDC team to start walking us through some of the great context and research that they've been undertaking over the last several months and years, quite frankly.
Great. Thanks, Monica. Hi, everyone. This is Dana Gunders, and you'll also be hearing from Darby Hoover and Joanne Berkenkamp, who Jason introduced in this section, but we're going to kind of roll through it just to keep it smooth here. And we just wanted, I know many of you have probably an extensive background in the whole topic of how much food gets wasted and how to manage it, but we did just want to really briefly level set, and I don't know if you guys can advance the slides, Rockefeller, over there, but essentially, just to get everyone on the same page here, about 40% of the food in this country goes uneaten. And what initially brought NRDC to that issue as primarily an environmental organization is the huge amount of resources that get invested in growing and transporting and cooling and cooking that food. And as we looked into it, also, the social impacts of that as well. But when we start looking at the resource impacts, we invest the equivalent of almost a fifth of our fertilizer, water, cropland into food that never gets eaten. The greenhouse gas implications are equivalent to that of about 37 million cars. And to add insult to injury, food is the #1 product entering our landfills today. So just a huge resource impact, and also a nutritional one. You guys can go to the next slide. Actually, our slides are a little off here. My apologies for that. But from a nutrition standpoint, 141 trillion calories of food are getting thrown out each year in the U.S. That's a number far too big for any of us to fathom, but what it translates to is that about 1/3 of all the food that we currently throw out would be enough to feed every single food insecure American, of which there are about 42 million, their entire diets. Now, of course, there's challenges in distributing that food, but just to give you a sense of scale, and there certainly are opportunities to capture some of that food and address some of the more immediate needs around food insecurity with it. If you guys can advance the slide, please. Thank you. So NRDC has a number of different arms of work on this. We are working at the consumer level. We're working at on state and federal policy. We're looking at various corporate lines of work, but a huge focus of ours right now is working with cities. And the reason for that is that we really see three opportunities, three aspects of the opportunity for cities. First of all, we know that oftentimes cities or counties are the ones who are in charge of waste management, and therefore there's the ability to address that waste management through reducing the waste burden. Secondly, we know that there's food insecurity issues, particularly in urban settings, that can, again, help be addressed if food rescue is part of the strategies that are used to address it. And finally, we know that many cities have climate goals and sustainability goals, and because of the huge resource impacts that wasting food has, some of those can be addressed, or a chunk of it can be addressed through through addressing how much food is getting wasted. And if you could go to that pyramid slide, just to pass you one kind of bit of framing that we use to think about this, there's a lot of different ways that wasting food can be addressed. We like to think of it similar to the reduce, reuse, recycle mantra for recycling, in that, first and foremost, it's really important to prevent how much food is getting wasted, or prevent how much surplus food is created. And in order to do that, there is, a lot of the waste in the U.S. is actually, when you stop to think about it, kind of designed into our system today, either because it's very low cost to throw food out, to buy food, to throw it out, or just because of the specifications we're using and the way we're operating does not try to minimize the amount of food. So some of that is really designed in, and by rethinking our processes, we can help to try to design some of it out. And also take steps to just prevent how much surplus is occurring in the first place. When that's not possible, we would like to prioritize getting that food to people who can use it, which is often done through food rescue organizations and efforts. And then when that's not possible, that's when we look to programs like composting, anaerobic digestion, and animal feed, and other options to recycle that food waste, and at minimum be able to recover some of the nutrients and get some of the benefits of recycling that product. So with that, I will pass it to Darby. Next slide.
Hi, folks. I'm just going to issue a quick reminder for everybody to please mute your audio if you're not speaking. There's a lot of background noise right now. If you're in the BlueJeans interface and you go to the bottom right, you should see a little audio microphone that you can click, and it should say audio off. That would be greatly appreciated. Okay, so cities, as Dana just noted, are important agents that can act on food waste and have motivations to act on food waste. But of course, the first step for anybody hoping to make big changes, especially in something like how much waste is being produced, is to measure what you hope to manage. So with the support of the Rockefeller Foundation, NRDC conducted a study to try to assess in 3 study cities, Nashville, Denver, and New York City, not only how much food is going to waste, but some of the characteristics of that food that's being wasted. So while many cities have done waste audits that tell you percentages of materials going out in your waste stream, few cities know what types of food are going to waste, how much of that food may have been potentially edible, and the reasons that that food is going to waste. And trying to get at some of that, we feel, is really the best way to understand where there are opportunities for food waste reduction, as well as opportunities to tailor messaging and education to your particular city's needs. So in our study, we got a number of residential volunteer participants, households that kept a kitchen diary for 1 week to track how much, what types of food they were discarding, why they were discarding it, and whether they discarded it to a bin that was destined for landfill or down the drain or fed it to the dog. We also did a subset of bin digs where we took the waste collected from the garbage bins for those households and went through it to determine in some detail what types of food were in there and how that matched with the diary information. And we did surveys to capture demographic as well as motivational attitudes, behaviors around food. For the industrial, commercial, institutional, or ICI sector, we looked at doing estimates that are formulated from other studies, sector-based. I'm going to ask one more time on the muting. I'm still getting a lot of interference. If folks could please check and make sure you're on mute, that would be great. Thank you. And with those estimates, we were able to issue sector-based baseline estimates of how much food waste may be generated in particular business sectors. We did bin digs in a variety of different sectors related to food service and food processing to try to ascertain ground truthing for the estimates we had conducted. And we did some basic business surveys so that we could get information on what the businesses were doing with regard to food and to waste. Next slide. And for our the types of information that we're going to be able to show you as a result of this study include information that shows how much we think is being generated in each of these three cities relative to the other sectors. So these are examples. These are still drafts, so they're not associated with particular cities in our study just yet. But this is the type of information that we're hoping to be able to provide for these cities. But you'll note that for these two draft pies, even though they both share the characteristic of having a very large chunk of residential waste and a very large chunk associated to restaurants and caterers, the slices are not the same size. And what this shows us is really the need to have that kind of city level assessment to really help us figure out what are the particular opportunities within each individual city. Within each city, we can use this kind of information to target actions in sectors where there is a lot of food waste occurring, or sectors maybe with fewer actors but a still significant slice of the pie where it might be easier to tackle just working with a smaller number of entities, or priority sectors where maybe cities already have initiatives in place. Next slide. We also will be able to use the survey results from the residential sectors of all three cities to determine things related to attitudes and behavior that may help guide educational campaigns. So, for example, on this slide, and this is the sort of sneak peek of some of our results that we're going to be able to release, in all three cities, when we asked the question, do you think the amount of edible food you throw out is more than, the same as, or less than the average American? A total of 76% of respondents in each of the three cities, even though the sub numbers are a little bit different, think that they waste less food than the average American. Obviously, since this is mathematically impossible, it shows that people think they're wasting less food than they are, which points to two things. It points to the need to educate folks about the specific strategies they can use to reduce food waste, but also really education on the scope of the problem. So again, we're not thinking that these necessarily extrapolate to the entire U.S., although I will note that this particular result is in line with similar studies that have shown about 3/4 of respondents thinking that they waste less food than average. So we will be presenting much more complete information and the full results of all of this information gathering in a report that will be released hopefully later this summer. And I will now turn it to Joanne.
Great, everyone. So this is Joanne Bergenkamp. I'm also part of NRDC's food waste team, and I want to tell you a little bit about a second body of work that's looking at the question of how much food is out there in communities that potentially could be recovered for the benefit of people in need. And so in many communities, it's actually fairly possible to tell how much food is being donated currently, but it's not necessarily so apparent how much potential is out there that is yet untapped for food to be donated. So we really did this body of work to assess how big is that pie of untapped opportunity for food recovery in Denver, Nashville, and New York City. So we've done these estimates, and we've developed a calculator that will enable additional cities to conduct similar, if somewhat more streamlined, versions of our analysis. So as you can see here, we focused on consumer-facing businesses, namely retail, restaurants, institutions, and catering. And we've been fortunate to have some really terrific partners share detailed information with us, which has enabled us to develop some very innovative metrics for estimating how much potential is out there for increasing donations in particular sectors. And so our metrics are based on extrapolations from very detailed current donation data, for instance, and things like detailed information on pre-consumer plate waste rates. So one of the examples I want to give you is things like metrics being tied to the number of beds in healthcare facilities, sales in grocery and restaurant sectors, and the number of K-12 and university students. So you can see on this slide some of the businesses and nonprofits that have contributed their data to our analysis. And as I mentioned, we'll also be publishing a user-friendly calculator to enable other cities to conduct similar types of analyses. So if you move on to the next slide, I'll give you a sense of what our analysis is yielding. So this is just a quick illustration of the data that we're developing for one of our cities. And I'm showing this here in percentage terms. When we release the data later this summer, we'll be showing it in tonnage figures as well. But as you can see here, the potential that we're showing is occurring in a set of different sectors. Groceries is the largest opportunity with almost 40% of the maximum potential that we see under this scenario. And that's really driven by the potential to expand donation of healthy perishable foods like fruits and vegetables, meat, dairy, and deli items. Full-service restaurants also hold considerable promise for growth, and we see important opportunities as well with hospitality like hotels, healthcare, and convenience stores. So for each of the three cities, Nashville, Denver, New York, we'll estimate the degree to which the city's meals gap, representing the missing meals for food insecure populations, could be reduced under different scenarios for expanding food donation. And then lastly, in Denver, we're doing a deeper dive with the food rescue organizations that are working on the ground there to assess the particular types of capital investments and operating funds that would be needed for Denver to more fully realize their potential to increase food donation, as we've identified. And our goal with this is really to put a price tag on what it would take in terms of investments in staff, transportation, refrigeration, and the like, to get from here to there, to go from where we are to realizing more of that potential, and then to use that analysis to foster and inform dialogue about food recovery infrastructure needs, not only with recovery organizations themselves, but with key players in the government sector, philanthropy, and the business community. And with that, let's move on to the next slide.
Thanks, Joanne. This is Jason Babby again. And as I mentioned, sort of urban solutions, we work in a number of cities across the country, in 25 to be exact, on a full range of issues. And so we used some of our experience in working on those issues in those places, as well as digging down deeper into this issue and in the cities that we've been talking to. And we've really, I think, come up with what we think are three common barriers on why cities aren't necessarily tackling this. You know, we see a big problem, we see a lot of potential. So why is it more happening? I think the first is the access to some of this basic data, and sort of that's why we've sort of spent so much time with the work of Darby and Joanne, and uncovering that and sort of taking a look at that. We also have seen in a number of issues there's a lack of capacity at the city level. City governments are being asked to do more and more with less. And particularly sometimes with a new initiative, it's hard to get the staff needed and some of the resources needed to get something new and innovative up and running, despite a strong desire to do so. And the last thing is sort of, I guess, what we have as knowing where to start, that there's a lot of potential out there and there's some things for innovation, but how do we know what is going to actually deliver success and what's sort of worth our time and investment? And sort of that's why we sort of talked a little bit about this toolkit. So next slide. Now is actually when we want to hear from you. And, you know, we thought that if you want to ask any clarifying questions, you know, it's at a pretty high level around the data and the information that we presented thus far, but I've also sort of teed up here on the screen 3 potential questions that we're interested in asking from you, which are, is the preliminary information from our study of food waste generation and rescuability surprising to you? Is any of the information we presented new, or did you expect it? Would it be useful to generally know where your food waste is generated and the potential for rescue in your city and help define what you're doing and thinking of doing? And are there other major barriers that you're seeing for your city to tackle food waste that we did not identify or mention? And of course, there are other things and any other insights that you have that we would love to open it up and have a little bit of a dialogue for a while. Does anything have any point that they would like to share?
Jason, could you clarify whether folks should be typing questions into the chat box or whether people should unmute and ask their question by audio?
I think they can unmute and ask their question by audio. Thanks.
So this is Paul Cronin from Hennepin County in Minneapolis. I think your second question there is a particularly important question to get an idea of where the food waste is and where the potential is. That's very valuable information.
Thank you, Paul.
We received one from a comment asking, what is the sample size for the studies?
Darby, do you want to handle your sample size first?
Yeah, for the residential baseline study, we had a total of over 600 participants from all 3 cities, and several hundred businesses were analyzed. Basically, anybody who's listed as being in the post related to food service. Actually, the conference room is the one I think that we're getting the feedback from. I don't know if it's possible to just quickly mute when others are talking. And then for the ICI and residential bin digs, it was a smaller sample size. We did about 100 ICI bin digs and about, I think, 200 residential bin digs.
Thanks, Darby. And Joanne, do you want to talk a little bit about the size of the data and sort of the scope that you were looking at?
Sure. So we were fortunate to partner with folks like Feeding America and Food Donation Connection. Food Donation Connection handles about 50 million pounds a year of mainly prepared food from restaurants that are donated. And of course, Feeding America is the leading organization on the side for the grocery industry that we looked at. And we were able to access data for probably 22,000 locations in the United States that currently donate food. And that enabled us to sort of plot out some distribution bell curves, essentially, that tell you a lot about current rates of distribution and what best practices and the highest performers are doing and the rate at which they donate. So we could take those current very high performers, tie it back to things like sales, and come up with metrics like pounds donated per $100 of sales. And that allows us both to describe the current reality and to do some analysis around how much growth is possible. So I think these metrics are going to be pretty exciting for folks to take a look at once we release it this summer. It was based on the best available data, quite large databases in the United States of current donation rates.
Okay. Thanks, Joanne. Are there other questions or potential perspectives to share?
Hi, this is Blake from Denver. I would say on item 2, we're exceptionally excited about having the data to better target our efforts. So for us, starting with a baseline that's a little more fine-grained than the 40% has been really important. And then in terms of the third question there, I think we're also looking at policy barriers, both those that are sort of actually in place, like, for example, some of our pantries that do any food cooking have a public health regulation that limits them to 52 days of operation per year without the next level of certification. So what are those actual policy barriers? And then how can we address a lot of the misinformation around perceived policy barriers, particularly from the donor side, where we've heard from many businesses that it's just not worth the business risk, which to us means they probably don't understand the legislative protections that we already have in place at the state and local level. So those are two other issues that I think are very much real barriers for us.
Thank you, Blake.
Hi, this is Jenny. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Jenny.
Okay. I work in the Twin Cities area, and thank you for having us on the call. We are starting to do more residential focus and aren't ready necessarily for business focus because we don't really have the resources, staff mostly, to focus on that. And if we're focusing more on residential, because we've seen that residents make a large majority of the food waste or wasted food, then I don't really know if we should focus on donation because there's a lot of barriers for residents to donate, mostly because it's prepared food or timing. So I'm not sure what to do about that. And for our cities, they don't want to focus on education as much because most of our cities are not organized, so they have multiple haulers and don't have anything to do with their trash. So that's a barrier for us. And then I'm also just in the donation aspect, I kind of am leery of focusing on food donation for residents because it's already created, and I'd rather focus on not purchasing excess and trying to cut back on having that situation where you might have to donate. That's where my mind is, and that's just a general thought for me. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Jason, I can respond to that if you like. Jenny, that's a really good point. And in fact, the reason why we focused on those businesses is because that's where we see the potential for food donation, not so much with individuals at home participating in donation, which, in most contexts is not going to make it past your food safety health inspectors. But those commercial sectors are more where the action is likely to be. That's a great point.
Any other questions or perspectives that folks would like to share? Okay. If not, maybe we'll go on to the next section and talk a little bit about the toolkit and Urena. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So let me start with a little bit of background on sort of the goal of this initiative of the toolkit and what we're hoping to do here. Our goal is to develop a set of resources that help cities reduce food waste while addressing hunger relief and supporting local businesses and nonprofit organizations. And let me just say, this is very much a work in progress. We are, excited to share with you where we are today, and I'm very interested, as we've said, in hearing your feedback and hearing your perspective. Also, we recognize that tackling food waste is a relatively new field with a lot of activity, and so our approach has been to look at what has been done across cities. Many of those cities are represented here on this call, which is great. But looking across cities in the United States and to highlight some of what we're seeing as the most doable and impactful strategies. The list of measures that we will walk through are not intended to be exhaustive, but rather to be both practical and to result in real change. At the end of this presentation, we sort of teed up a few questions that we'd love for you all to be thinking about and that we'd love to hear from you about, such as, what is your experience? What has your experience been with food waste reduction strategies? Which strategies from the list that we discuss have you implemented or have you explored? Which strategies are more or less interesting to you? In terms of the work in your city, and then lastly, but importantly, what is missing, right? So are there items that you're not hearing us talk about that you feel should be included? So here's an sort of overview of the items included in the toolkit. And as you can see across the top of this inverted food waste reduction pyramid, we've added a rethink category, and that basically is covering strategies that span across the reduce, rescue, and recycle categories. Along the right-hand side, you'll see the list of different objectives within each of these broader categories. And these are general strategies. We recognize that we need to take into account local characteristics, and the goal that we've set out is to provide guidance that can be modified based on local needs and local characteristics. Also, just to sort of be clear, we're not suggesting that all cities must or should do all of these things. The goal really is for cities to do as much as they can and build on their progress, and for us to provide resources to help with that along the way. I'll also note here that some of the measures that we'll describe in this toolkit are relatively easy to implement. Emphasis on the word relatively. For example, they don't require legislation. And then there are others that would take longer and require legislation or policy change, and which can certainly be a heavier lift. Our goal was sort of to include both types, to have a balance between impact and level of effort. So you'll see kind of a mix of those as we walk through. So starting with the first category of rethink, we start with establishing a baseline and then setting data-informed targets for reduction. So we've heard a bit about the food waste audit work that NRDC has been doing with New York City, Denver, and Nashville on this. One of the resources that is coming out of that work, in addition to the data, is the NRDC team is developing a food waste calculator that can then be used by other cities to help with this step and help to hopefully make this a little bit easier for folks. Another strategy that some cities are deploying in this regard is to require waste reporting by haulers that are contracted by the city. And actually, if I could just pause here and just remind folks, if you're able to mute your line, that would be very helpful. You can do that either if you're on the phone or if you're on the screen. Through Blue Jeans, you should be able to see an icon on the bottom right that allows you to mute. Thank you. So just as an example, I heard Amanda from the City of Austin on the line. The City of Austin requires private haulers to report twice a year on the amount of solid waste, recyclables, and organic materials that they collect. So that's an example of cities, finding ways to get at some of this information and build towards their baseline. The next component within this category is to establish specific short-term and long-term targets to reduce food waste. And this, of course, can and should be informed by the baseline assessment, and also, is often included as part of a broader waste reduction plan. On the next slide, under the rethink frame, is the goal of modifying collection policies with the aim of laying the groundwork for broader waste prevention and reduction efforts. So let me just start by saying there is a lot of information, I think, on this slide. And this is certainly one that I think is probably a heavier lift and requires a significant amount of policy and process to move forward on. But the basic idea here is really to lay that foundation, right? So in order to be able to move toward a more comprehensive food waste reduction policy. And so, the ultimate policy that we may want to get to may be to transition to an economic incentive-based system like pay as you throw or save as you throw, which I know, for example, New York City is exploring. But before taking that step, it makes sense to, evaluate your waste system, to identify opportunities for policy changes that really boost prevention and reduction efforts. And just as a couple of examples of these steps, one is ensuring that new commercial and multifamily buildings have adequate space for on-site organics collection. And another, is requiring haulers to offer organics collection, among other strategies listed here. Next, under the reduce category, we start with increased public awareness. And I think that, certainly the data point that Darby put out in terms of, most people believing that they waste less than average, is one indicator that public awareness is an important area to focus on. Some of you may have seen it. I know some of you are already using the Ad Council's Save the Food campaign materials. And these are resources that are available to cities as part of a national campaign that was developed by NRDC and the Ad Council that can help educate consumers about food waste and can be part of a targeted marketing and communication strategy to raise public awareness on the issue. Those resources include sort of marketing collateral, signs that you can put up on billboards, on the side of a truck, videos. So there's a lot of resources there, and we've had some really good experiences with cities being able to leverage those, and in some cases even get donated space to put up those ads throughout the city. Another resource in this space, of course, is the EPA's Food Too Good to Waste Toolkit. So also under reduce is the need to engage and support local businesses and community organizations. One way to do that is to launch a food waste challenge where restaurants sign up to reduce the amount of food that they waste. I know that Nashville Online has launched its Mayor's Food Savers Challenge and already has signed up about, I think, 55 restaurants to participate in that effort. And this also, I think, highlights this strategy, I think, also highlights how different measures really can complement each other. When we think about increasing public awareness and leveraging the Save the Food campaign materials, it can be a really nice complement with a food waste challenge, for example, where you're sharing that collateral with the restaurants that are participating, and their participation is reinforcing the public awareness of the issue. Also, under reduce, we have lead by example, and I should note that I think here this might be one of those sort of cross-cutting issues that really can go cut across reduce, recycle, and rescue. But the idea here really is about instituting policies and initiatives within city government to raise awareness, boost donations in composting, and encourage vendors to adopt similar behaviors. So this can include, for example, training employees at government food service operations, making compost bins easily available at city offices, and actually using the compost on city-controlled properties. An example of this being implemented is in Orange County, California, where their largest correctional facility was able to reduce their annual waste disposal costs through a combination of waste reduction, composting, and donating surplus food. And through these measures and other actions, they were able to reduce their annual waste cost from $67,000 to $17,000. So on to rescuing surplus food and getting it into the hands of those that need it. I think this slide might better be titled Address Perceived Policy Barriers to Food Donation, because often the challenge is not necessarily the policy itself, but how well understood donation policy is at the level of health agencies and other agencies and actors along the food donation chain. Strategies to address this and to clarify and communicate food waste donation policies include training health inspectors and issuing guidance for agencies. And I think a good example here is the City of Seattle, which has developed materials and training sessions so that agencies that are handling donations, hunger relief agencies, and food donors are really all on the same page and have a shared understanding of what the regulations are for safely collecting and distributing surplus food, and that's helped them to increase the effectiveness of their food rescue industry and their food rescue operations. Building infrastructure and capacity, specifically to support the food rescue industry, is the next item that we wanted to touch on. And here, this can include providing grants for food rescue related staffing and infrastructure, which, is, as you know, is often a very sort of resource constrained set of operations. And also supporting training, research, and coordination among food rescue organizations to help fill some of those gaps. And an example of training and coordination that I think is quite strong is the Waste Not Orange County example, which is it's a public-private partnership between the county health department and the Orange County Food Bank that facilitates donation of surplus food to local partners. And another example of this actually is the LA Food Policy Council, which has established a food waste prevention and rescue working group, which is basically charged with the goal of advancing food recovery efforts. So really looking at where are the gaps and where are the opportunities to connect different organizations and different resources to really make the most out of what they have available. So on the the bottom last slice of the inverted food waste pyramid, we have recycle. And the in this section, we wanted to highlight ways to invest in infrastructure for anaerobic digestion and centralized as well as decentralized composting facilities, including, for example, identifying existing local organic recycling capacity and large generators of food. So again, sort of getting a sense of sort of where you're at, and then developing a plan to assess opportunities to invest in centralized composting and in anaerobic digestion infrastructure. And then finally, here, this is a section that, or a category that spans beyond the city level, but where we see opportunities to, identify areas where working with states and counties can play a role in helping to achieve a city's food waste objectives. And just to highlight a couple of examples here, collaborating with state or local counties on harmonizing food safety regulations related to food donations so that everyone is sort of working off of the same rules and the same system, and making that easier for food donors to navigate. and also streamlining permitting for composting and anaerobic digestion facilities is something that cities might want to look at collaborating at the state level with. And so with that, I wanted to just sort of perhaps re-highlight the questions that we had for folks, and very much interested in feedback on these questions directly or other thoughts that folks may have. But just to sort of hone in on these for a minute, what has been your experience with food waste reduction strategies? Which strategies from the list have you implemented or explored? Which strategies are most and least interesting to pursue in your city? And we started to get a little bit at that, and would love to hear a little bit more. And then again, what's missing from this list?
Great. And some folks have been sharing questions over the chat function, so thank you, and encourage more of that. A few that I'll sort of synthesize for us here. There have been several questions around organics collection programs, and from two angles. So one is, as we think about moving up the hierarchy in prevention, is there a risk with rolling out organics collection that you are disincentivizing individuals from preventing food waste? A second question is, for cities that are practically rolling out these programs and thinking about the infrastructure requirements, such as transportation, are there trade-offs from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective in terms of reducing overall emissions footprint, particularly when this requires to add additional fleet and routes to the road? What is the trade-offs with that versus reducing food waste from landfills? And then there was another question more on the prevention and the measurement side around what are technologies and approaches that either cities who are doing challenges around different sectors using to help those businesses, or businesses themselves using to measure food waste within their operations. Joanne, for those that didn't see, helpfully provided a couple of examples, such as mint scraps, but perhaps it'd be helpful just to share that out for the group.
Great. So, yeah.
Yeah, the risk of the trade-off. Do you want to start that? Maybe Darby can finish.
Perfect. Yeah, I think, the first question that I heard, the organics collection, right, and disincentivizing, the extent to which that disincentivizes reduction strategies, I think, we want to look at this as sort of a comprehensive set of policies and take them, kind of look at them holistically. I think that's a really great question. I would maybe pass it to Darby to speak to that more specifically. I know she's looked at that question quite a bit. And also, Darby, you may want to speak to the trade-offs as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question about, does organic collection make it harder to promote wasted food reduction? I'd also love to hear some examples from the cities that are on the line. But in my experience, it is true that when you implement composting programs, people feel less guilty about throwing out food into the compost than they do into the trash. So there's a little bit of preliminary indication from our survey results that may be something that we're going to see, at least from one of our cities. And it's certainly something I've seen in other surveys, that folks do feel less guilty about wasting food if they can compost. On the other hand, the collection mechanism and infrastructure can really provide some of that backdrop for the reduction education. So accompanying any information and education around composting absolutely can and should be information around waste reduction as well. So I think it opens up the opportunity to get people thinking about the food that they're wasting, and that mechanism can absolutely be used to promote reduction. On the flip side, the other question about when you're adding organic collection, are you adding truck traffic? That's something that's going to vary from community to community. And I would say what I've seen is different solutions coming out of different communities that include things like reducing collection of garbage to maybe every other week is one example. Splitting recycling and organics collection so that those are maybe every other week. Of course, what we're hoping for here is that it's the same volume or even less volume total. It's just how it's split up. There are other folks who've tried doing combined trucks so that they can collect more than one material in the same truck. So I think, and there's other folks that have done things like franchising or other service agreements that reduce the collection area and that make sure that the trucks only go within distinct areas. So there's a number of different approaches that I think can handle the reshuffling of the same material into different bins, and hopefully, again, maybe less if we're doing some of that reduction. But some of that is going to be dependent upon the particular infrastructure in your city. And I think I'm hoping other folks may have examples on both of those as well.
Great. Yeah, maybe, do we want to maybe stick on this topic and hear some feedback from folks first, but then we definitely have it in the queue around sort of the technology sort of to measure, and we'll definitely get to that. But maybe any other thoughts on folks have about sort of right sizing sort of their organics infrastructure, or what they maybe see as with some of these other potential initiatives, or what they see as potential disincentives or not that they've tackled, and or the transportation or collection trade-off issue. Yeah, folks. No.
Hi,
No.
this is Jenny. Okay. This is Jenny from Twin Cities area, and we're focusing heavily at our county level on the wasted food reduction first, as organics drop off and eventually curbside will be coming down the line, we know. And we already hear about, as soon as you mentioned food waste, they jump to composting, residents jump to composting. So we're trying to, promote what they can do before composting, of course. We're using what you had on your slide for resources. We've identified our target audiences as families with kids and the young professionals with dynamic lifestyles. And we are definitely articulating benefits of what they will get from reducing food waste. And we're using the Save the Food and Food to Good to Waste toolkits, which are great. One thing that we're kind of struggling with is more of a measurement. We don't really know how to measure besides, media impressions. It's really hard for us to measure, especially since we have an open hauling system. So I'd love some guidance in that. And one thing that I'm trying to be very mindful of, and I'm hoping that it reaches the national level, is to maybe, for the prevention part, change our language, do not be food waste oriented, but wasted food, so that we can take our minds off of what's happening with the food after it's not edible, but actually moving back to what made it not edible. So that's just a kind of something we're working on regionally, of trying to change our language. Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, this is Blake from Denver, and on that point, I think we see them as deeply integrated. At least we're going to try to do a rollout where compost hauling and prevention are sort of two forks of the same strategy. And for us, that makes sense because one of our targets for doing this campaign is actually to get people to sign up for city organics hauling, which we're rolling out to citywide by the end of this year. So that is going to be one of the key metrics that we drive, along with business signups into some of our. We have a program called Certifiably Green, which kind of helps businesses with technical assistance, goal setting, et cetera, for more sustainable business operations.
Hi, this is Jennifer in Los Angeles. I like Jenny's comments. I agree with those. The term that's being used out here too is food recycling, which I find problematic. I don't think people really understand what that means. One concept we're throwing out is before the bin. We're trying to stress all the activities that should take place before any material of any type is placed into a bin. We're in we have a rather unique situation that we're rolling out a zone-based franchise system where the franchise haulers will handle all trash, blue bin, and organics collection, but they each have to subcontract with a food rescue organization and a reuse organization. But I agree, just there's a lot of terminology out there, and I would like to see some more standardized national approaches to that. Food recycling bothers me. I think it ought to be food scrap, possibly, just to better distinguish edible, recoverable food from things that go into a compost bin.
I'm going to jump in real quick on that. This is Darby. I couldn't agree more that we have to be careful about, and I want to touch on that other one too, that we really have to be careful about our terminology. It's hard not to shortlist and say things like, oh, great, we're going to reduce, reuse, and recycle food waste. But of course, we're not doing any of that. We're reducing wasted food, we're recovering surplus food, and we're recycling scraps. So being specific about what we're trying to do, and even if we reduce all the food, we're still going to have the inedible parts that we want to compost, I think is important, even though it sometimes is unwieldy. We've got to be clearer about what we're talking about. So I totally agree there. And then on the other piece, in terms of referring it to as organics recycling, I'm absolutely open to other suggestions. And I hear you about the difference between food recycling and organics recycling. I tend to use organics recycling, and part of that is wanting to emphasize that right now we have some strategies that fall under that heading, and we have some strategies that maybe fall under their own heading.
As controller,
like animal feed. So trying to be clearer again about what we mean by each of those, but also to note that there are ways that we want to emphasize the ecological benefits of returning nutrients and organic matter back to a nutrient cycle or organic matter cycle. That to me is helpful, especially as we start having conversations that include mentioning anaerobic digestion as a way to generate energy, but that don't emphasize it as a way to return nutrients and organic matter back to the soil. So I think focusing on that recycling piece in some sense is important. Totally open to new terminology and appreciate bringing it up.
Hey, Darby, I just wanted to say Jennifer Pinkerton from the Paper Coalition from your previous life.
Hi, Jennifer. Wow, that's been a while.
Yeah, how are you?
Great to talk to you.
Yes.
Great.
Okay. Is there anything else that folks want to share on this point? Okay, not hearing anything right away. Maybe we should go back to the question that Monica raised about sort of the technology to measure, particularly at the business scale and maybe with the challenge. And Joanne, do we want to just maybe sort of tee you up for that?
Sure. That sounds great. So among businesses, when we think about monitoring and tracking of the food that's being wasted, there are really two prongs of work at hand. One is with post-consumer waste at the food that goes to waste after it's been served to someone, things like plate waste or food that's on a buffet line that's being discarded. And there is not a whole lot of tracking going on of those post-consumer losses. And it's really something I think that as a broader movement that's concerned about these issues that we really need to make more investment in, because a majority of the waste that occurs tends to be happening in that post-consumer phase. And there are some examples, like here in Minneapolis where I live, the University of Minnesota has had its students actually doing tracking of post-consumer food losses and actually, putting the food into bins and managing that, weighing it and tracking it and so forth. So there are some good kind of anecdotal examples of post-consumer waste that's being managed, but there's not enough of that going on. With pre-consumer, there are more options, and it tends to be a less costly venture. The best known of those pre-consumer tracking tools is LeanPath. They're a business based in Portland, Oregon, and they have a waste tracking platform that allows people to weigh the waste. There are models that allow you to photograph that, and then you record what it was, why it went to waste, what it cost, for instance, what time of day it occurred, and so forth. And that kind of data really allows businesses and empowers them to understand the causes of food that's being discarded, and it helps them manage it and figure out what to do about it. So LeanPath has been used quite extensively among institutional type clients like colleges and universities and hospitals and those types of institutions. It's not yet used in schools, I think, due to some of the cost and technology barriers. There's another group called MinScraps that has another software that tracks pre-consumer food losses. And then, something like the EPA has much simpler kind of Excel files that people can use to at least get started. And, my feeling about that kind of tracking is at whatever level you do it, and even if it's only for brief periods of time on a pilot basis, it's a really good thing to do. because it enables people to see what's happening. And once they start to recognize the scale of those issues and to have the information they need to manage it, then they really tend to get on board. And a great example of that is Aramark, the third largest food service management company in the country, did a pilot using the LeanPass software, and they found out that they could reduce their pre-consumer food losses by 36% in a period of about 3 months. So those are significant costs that they were able to save, and it led them to embrace this initiative where they're now rolling out food waste tracking software in 500 of their largest accounts across the country. So there are costs associated with doing that, but I think their example illustrates that the return on investment is quite high when you begin to measure.
Thanks, Joanne. Yeah. So we've listed a number of questions up there. Maybe I'll just sort of try and hone in on one of them, which I guess, we went through a number, about basically almost like a dozen potential strategies that cities could use to sort of help reduce. We sort of see, I think, some good energy around some of the business engagement and some of the public awareness efforts. And obviously, folks are looking at some of the organics collection as sort of three that seem to be rising to the top in this discussion. But are there others that folks are, seen today that they either are really interested in and sort of, would want to consider pursuing, or the flip side of that, or they've heard it and really have zero desire to try that in their city?
This is Jennifer from LA. I'm hoping my comments will address your point. We had a discussion with the Ad Council here once we became aware of the new campaign on food waste. And one thing that was very interesting to me is that the regional coordinator for the Ad Council said the Ad Council itself has not yet embraced the concept that municipalities can function as another media outlet for them. He said he's presented that several times, but the council seems resistant. I would like to see somebody address that. I mean, we have bus stops, we have buses, we have city vehicles. We represent a variety of media distribution channels in effect, and those have not yet been exploited. And I just see that something that, if that were to happen, I think that can make a huge difference just in exposure and awareness.
This is Dana. I can respond to that. I could not agree more. I've worked very closely with the Ad Council on our Save the Food campaign over the last 2 years, and we have actually we saw the exact same opportunity and a huge interest on the part of municipalities in using the campaign. And the way we've handled that, I think we are charting new territory with them,
Right.
in that sense. But we've found, a great medium where a few different things. One, cities can use the campaign materials, on the space that they own or have access to. And we're able to add the logos of the city or county to the ads. Two, if they have funding to support just the printing of the ads, the Ad Council is able to secure space in that area. So, with Santa Clara County in California, for instance, they put in about $5,000, and that translated, once into the printing, which it costs approximately $40 to print a bus stop ad, and a little bit more for a billboard. And then the space itself gets donated. And so that $5,000 actually translated into about $400,000 in donated media value once the ads were up and out. And then lastly, we've been able to design a set of what we're calling community outreach materials, which we've heard from municipalities can be useful. So things that can actually be, handed out at farmers markets, more tangible kind of meal planning tips and food storage guides and things of that nature that are a little more specific than the Ad Council tends to produce, but that we heard from municipalities can help tie the campaign together. And as we move forward and more assets get developed by the campaign itself, we're trying to make sure that those are also created in kind of downloadable, shareable form, not just for social media, but also for postcards or things that might municipalities might actually want to print and distribute. So, absolutely.
One thing that's been shared in the comments from Blake Adams from DC is both a resource and then I think a consideration as in terms of some of the barriers that you asked about, Jason. One, on the resource side, DC will be releasing a compost collections progress and feasibility study in the coming days. So I think that sounds like something that'd be of interest to all of us. But secondly, I think one of the points that Blake makes in his comments is that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. The layouts of cities, the infrastructure, the logistics all vary, and how cities need to adapt policies to navigate those matter. So in the case of organics collections, for example, given tight clearances and alleyways, certain vehicle types or collection processes that might work in one city may not be applicable in DC. And so I think unpacking for cities, what are some of the key variables that need to be considered and customized is an important part of a policy development program or process. Even if at a high level they sound really interesting, the feasibility of implementation may vary.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Blake. And it's something that Urban Solutions on some of our other programs has had to face, particularly some of the stuff around sort of energy efficiency, for instance. And that is something that actually has probably fewer variables than this pretty complicated space, but yet there are very much distinctions, and it's sort of something that NRDC has had to work through and sort of figuring out, okay, at the higher level, here's the thing that we want to be looking at, and then how do we create the local parameters sort of that make it work for that place. And we definitely got a very good sense of how different every place is, and particularly around sort of food waste in doing some of the baseline assessments even. And I know that sort of like, maybe Darby, you want to talk a little bit around some of the differences that we ran into with sort of building stock and collection and all of the things that we had to sort of tweak and work on as we were going from place to place and trying to create similar findings or something that was statistically significant in order to be carried from one place to another.
Sure. And first I want to say I really appreciate that folks are sharing some great examples and what you're up to in the chat box. And so I would encourage people to make sure you check that out as well. And I'm trying to compile the resources listed in the chat box. So hopefully those will be available. But I think one of the things we found in doing our baseline food waste assessment work, even just in 3 cities, is that everybody's city is very, very different, which we knew, but experiencing it firsthand. And the differences of trying to access different kinds of parts of the infrastructure for things like doing bin digs. So whether people put their bins out on the curb, whether they keep them by the house, whether they put them out the night before, the morning before, all of that impacts collection. The size of the bin can influence how often it goes to the curb. Things like whether you have single family or multifamily or small multifamily, all of that influences what you're able to collect as well as how you're able to collect it. So I'm more sympathetic ever than even I was before to some of the challenges that different cities face around how do you access different households for things like organics collection, and just would encourage the broad sharing of all the different examples that are out there, that I think there are so many out there. I would say that some of the consistent elements that I'm noting in successful approaches include the ability to design for different access as well as different placement of bins in new construction. So obviously, I think a lot of you will have had the experience that if you're trying to implement multifamily collection for a lot of different streams, that one of the things you run into very quickly is just limitations on how many bins can fit in a particular space. So that even if the waste is the same amount of waste, having to put extra bins in can really stymie some efforts So if you're able to think ahead to having new construction have those kinds of elements in it, that's helpful if to the extent that you're able to influence that. And I know that at least one of the comments in the chat box is around challenges of collection that have to do with particular street configurations. So I think the way that waste is collected in one place versus another, or even in different parts of a city, depending on what the different kinds of street structure look like, can really vary. So trying to develop a system that has that kind of flexibility for your city, I think is super important, and there are a lot of great examples out there.
Thanks, Darby. And actually, that's a nice segue to highlight another sort of resource that will be coming out later this year. A separate project that Rockefeller is funding is developing zero waste design guidelines to be piloted here in New York City. And this is for both residential and commercial, existing building stock and new construction. And we're working with the Center for Architecture to design these guidelines, really focusing on architects, developers, and urban planners and policymakers, and thinking about all of the questions that you're raising, from point of disposal through acquisition by the truck. How does different trash streams need to move through a building? How can we optimize to level the playing field in terms of disposal? How do we sort of maximize separation and minimize contamination? How do we think about different collection mechanisms and containers that I think get to one of the earlier comments that also become nudges to help people prevent waste, be it food, organic, recyclables in the first place, and then also properly dispose of them so that the cities and haulers can collect them effectively and safely. So these guidelines will be available this fall, really focused on New York, but given the diversity of building stocks in New York, we have a hypothesis that they will be useful, or at least our hope is that they will be useful for other cities. So that I think is something that may also be a useful resource for those considering these types of questions.
I just want to open it back up to sort of see if there are particular strategies here that folks may be gravitating more towards, or that are sort of, or gravitating away from on this. If not, we can sort of move on. Folks have been sharing some really good resources, as Darby noted, on the chat thing, and we are working to collect them and we'll sort of make sure of that. But I sort of want to maybe sort of raise a question, and sort of maybe if folks want to verbally share, is there anything that, you feel like we really missed in taking a look at some for cities? Is there one that, you've done or you've seen or you've thought of that you want to raise up? Okay, no worries. Unless there's anything else that folks want, maybe we'll.
I might jump in real quick.
Please.
So this is it's sort of along the veins of other parallel efforts. This is Blake from Denver. I know some of the food policy coordinators in cities across the U.S. have been talking about taking a resolution to the U.S. Conference of Mayors at their upcoming meeting this summer. And one of the potential directions of that would be to address food waste and to talk about maybe in terms of the farm bill, but more likely as more of a standalone issue, what cities can be doing and what kind of national efforts might be able to better help support that. So although it's an aside from some of our very specific local work, if anyone's engaged with that or would like to be, maybe just drop me a line in the chat box and we can start an email thread on the side. I know for a number of the mayors who are considering, this taking a resolution to the U.S. Conference of Mayors, food waste is one of those issues that cross-cuts so nicely between social justice issues, environmental preservation issues, and of course addressing food insecurity and food access in our low-income communities. So it has the potential to really sew together, at least at the high level, a lot of those different values. And I know it has been a real topic of interest for us here in Denver as well.
Thanks, Blake. Okay. to the next slide. So I just want to give a little bit of a sense of what sort of are some of the next steps from NRDC's perspective. This has been very valuable, and definitely thank you for having taken sort of a good chunk of time, almost an hour and a half now of your time, of your day, that is not insignificant for some very busy people. We are, if folks are okay, we may choose to do some individual follow-up to maybe get a little bit more clarification and some different information on sort of to dig deeper a little bit on some things and use this information to potentially further refine the toolkits and sort of looking about how we might want to potentially engage cities in the future. As sort of Yorita said, this, the toolkit is very much a work in progress. And, just in full disclosure, something that we are currently exploring is there an opportunity to potentially pilot some of these as a concept in a particular place or places. So those are the things that NRDC is thinking about right now. Just sort of wanted to put out there, but maybe sort of turn it over to Monica to sort of talk about sort of what's happening at Rockefeller.
Yeah, thanks, Jason, and really thank you all for some great comments and questions, both on the phone but also in the chat box. I know there were maybe some tricky points early on when the acoustics weren't quite right, so we'll make sure to commit and follow up and share some of the conversation and materials that we have here so you can go back and listen and maybe a little more clearly. Just to take a step back, I think reflecting on some of the conversation we just had, a couple key themes sort of emerged for me from the reflections and examples that everyone was sharing. I think the importance of behavior change for effective policy making and implementation really came through loud and clear, both at the resident side, as you think about organics collection and the tension that potentially can emerge between prevention and recycling and composting, but also just in engagement and sort of how they're changing their practices when they go grocery shopping and things that are sort of in the secondary sphere of influence that cities are thinking about, but have real implications on what your infrastructure requirements are or what programs might be most effective from a marketing standpoint or consumer education standpoint. And then certainly on the business side as well, there's partly the practicalities of how do you help businesses get the right tools to measure better and participate and adhere perhaps with ordinances that you might be putting in place, but also getting them bought in on the value of this and having sort of that demand to really reinforce good policy is quite critical. And I think that's something we're thinking a lot about here at Rockefeller. We recognize that food waste, it's one of those problems that everyone has a role to play in, be it as an individual, as a city, as a business. And so as we think about solutions, we're quite keen to find ways, how do we bring people along in those? And so I've heard on this call some examples around and questions that you have on engaging residents or business owners. And I've heard offline from some folks on this call and other municipalities on great programming that they're testing and piloting to do that. So I think we're really encouraging more of that. And as we think about what comes next, that will be a big part of some of the work that we're trying to seed in the way that we can. And sort of the second point, which is a bit sort of the comment from earlier around it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And I think these policies and programs are a great starting point. And hopefully, hopefully there's at least some new information here for folks on the call. Hopefully, or for those that are quite well versed in food waste prevention and reduction, it reinforced some things you already knew or gave some nuance to it. And maybe spark some questions on how might I do this in my own community, or what would be required to get this through my city council. Because I think those are the real considerations that we'll all need to be grappling with to translate some really compelling bullets and case studies into true implementation on the ground. And so some of the work you see on this slide here, as we think about what's next on the horizon from an RF perspective, there are a few other projects that we're supporting currently. I mentioned earlier this work with Center for Architecture around zero waste design guidelines. So taking one slice of a particular strategy and really trying to grapple with what would it take to really move that forward in a city. We're also looking at innovative models to distribute surplus food. We've recently supported an organization called Food for Soul that launches community kitchens that create delicious meals made out of food waste with amazing chefs. And really, it's sort of promoting not just food waste reduction and increased meal availability, but also social inclusion and job training and economic development opportunities. I think, if I were going to make a third point macro theme that I've heard, and Blake, you encapsulated it well at the end, was the opportunity for multiplicity of impacts by addressing food waste. And that's frankly why this is such an attractive issue to the Rockefeller Foundation, and why we really hope that municipalities are going to be excited and energized to take this on, as it ties into so many agendas and objectives that you're already trying to pursue. So those are a few things in addition, obviously, to this great partnership with NRDC that we continue to work on and will be sharing with this group and others as they come to fruition in the coming months and years. There are, as you see on the right-hand side of the slide, a few resources that we have already supported that are out in the world that may be of interest as you think about issues. So earlier this year, a report with the Initiative for a Competitive Inner City on how to think about building more resilient urban food systems was released. Highly recommend taking a look at that. I think it had some really interesting provocations for those thinking about the intersection of resiliency planning and food systems, and also food waste. An organization called Feedback, which some of you I know are quite familiar with, as Feedback has come to your city and hosted Feeding the 5,000 events, which are these amazing celebrations where 500, 5,000, 50, you can pick the number, but they feed a community with food that would have gone to waste, and use it as an opportunity to profile work that's already happening in those places, oftentimes partnering quite closely with municipal agencies, and use it as a way to really engage communities and businesses on the issue of food waste. There is one happening in Los Angeles on May 4th, so if you are LA-based, highly recommend stopping by Pershing Square. And then lastly, Further with Food, which is a resource that was launched at the beginning of this year and is an online platform that aggregates food loss and waste solutions, some of which are very city-focused, others are much more broad. But for those that might be newer to this space, this could be an interesting and helpful place for you to go and learn more. Certainly as we continue to put forth work, reports and tools and resources will live there. So I think this hopefully will be a great sort of hub for folks looking to sort of lead in the space. So with that, and certainly if there are any, we do have a little time. So if there are last questions or comments after I wrap, please feel free to jump in if you have others. But I just want to say thank you again for this. I hope for some of you we've worked with before and we're close friends at this point. Others we've had conversations with. In some cities, I'm very excited to say this is the first time we've engaged with you. And so I hope that this is going to be the start of more conversations around how the groups at the table can be most helpful to you as you're trying to affect change in your own communities and move forward on this important issue. So please don't be shy. Stay in touch. I'll pass it back to Jason as his contact information is on the final slide. But you have mine as well, so please don't hesitate to reach out, and thank you.
Great. Yeah, no, I'm happy. I just want to say, this is my contact information. So if you'd specifically like for us to follow up with you as sort of a follow-on conversation, feel free to email me, and we will definitely schedule a time to do so. That'll probably be sometime over the course of May. Or if there's anything else that you want to share or want more information on, I'm happy to take it and then pass it along to the right person, whether that be at Rockefeller or at NRDC. And we have some time, so if there's anything that anyone wants to share that maybe didn't feel the right time or the right set of questions, but want to make sure that we're aware, want to sort of open that up, and but that sort of was it from our end. Okay, well, I'm not hearing anything again, so thank you so much for taking so much time to, learn about and provide feedback on something that we've all been working and thinking about quite a bit ourselves. And I hope everyone has a good remainder of the day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.